Alright guys, so this will be a shorter video. We'll be covering the input function, how it works, and also see some examples of how we would use it in Python. So the purpose of the input function is to allow us to take data in to our console, right? Because you can always make programs without input, but not being able to have input limits what you can do with your programs. Because think of the example we've seen in class about the calculator. A calculator that can't take an input really has no purpose, you know? So the input function allows us to take data in from the console. So to give us an understanding of how it works, we're going to see three things today. We're going to go over the input function, the type function, and type conversion, and why we need type conversion, and how we use type conversion. Alright guys, so let's take a look at the input function. Now let's take a second to think about what I said in the introduction of this video. I said that the point of the input function is to take data in to our program, right? So with us taking data in, we need somewhere to store that data. So the first part of the input function, or the first part of using the input function, will always be creating a variable. Because variables are where we store data, so when we're taking data in, we need somewhere to store them, and that's why we need a variable. So in this example, I'm going to write a program that asks the user to enter their first name. So I'm going to create a variable and I'll call it f_name. Alright? And since we're using a variable and we want to assign a value to this variable, we need the assignment operator, the equal sign. Next, we're going to actually use the input function. So the first thing we do is write input, then parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, we put the message for the user. So I'm going to say, what is your first name? And this /n simply prints the simply brings the cursor to the next line. There's nothing fancy. It's just to make the program look nice. All right. So the next thing I'll do after they enter their first name is I'll print it. Okay. And I'm going to take a break here so we can use the debugger to see what happened. All right, so we have our debugger up and running. So far we have no variables, but when we actually click run, we'll see the first thing that happens is it asks the user the message, what is your name? So if you take a look at the console, you'll see what is your name. And I'm going to type in my name, Brian, when I hit the enter key, because with the input function, when you ask the question, the user has to type in a value and then they have to hit the enter key. Because the input function doesn't know how long their input will be. So when you hit the enter key, you say, hey, I'm done putting in information. That's the end of it. So I'm going to hit the enter key now. And if you look, it creates my variable f_name and it stores the value Brian inside, right? So the input function has a few parts. The first part is the variable. So you can give it somewhere to store the data you get from taking in input. The next thing is the assignment operator, because we need to assign that value to the variable. Next, we have the input followed by parentheses. And then we have a message for the user in quotation marks. And then when we hit run, our message shows on the console right here. We type that value in, and then that value is stored inside our variable. But the whole point is we create a variable and the input function allows us to store a value inside that variable. So let's take it one step further. I'm going to create another variable for last name, and then we'll print out this information. All right, so here we have the same program. When I hit run, ask me first for my first name. I put Brian, and then it stores my first name inside that variable. So you can see that right here. F name is holding the data that I typed in. Okay. And then it asks me for my last name. All right. And now we have two variables. So we have F name holding Brian, and then we have L name holding Chambers. Right? So you can see that the input function takes whatever I type on the console and stores it inside the variable. Now let's see what our output will look like. All right, so it prints out my first name, Brian, and then it prints out my last name, Chambers. All right, so the next thing we'll cover as it relates to the input function is type conversion and why we need type conversion. So I'll show you with an example. I'm going to create two variables, num1, and I'll use the input function to ask the user to enter a number. And I'll say num2. I'll do the same thing. And for our program, we'll just print the sum right? So we'll just print the sum of num1 and num2. So I'm going to run the program myself and see what we got. So for the first number, I'll enter 5. For the second number, I'll enter 3. So when I add 5 and 3, I should get 8. So let's see what the computer gives us. So we got 53 instead of 8, and this is because of one major issue that the input function has. And that issue is that the input function treats all input as strings. So when I'm entering 5, it treats it like the string 5, and when I enter 3, it treats that like the string 3. And when you add two strings together, it just attaches them. So 5 and 3, instead of being 8, it sees it as a string and it combines them into one big string. So let's see what we can do about that. All right, so I have the debugger open. So I'm going to run that same program and see what's being stored inside our variable. So it asks me to enter a number. I'll enter 5. And if you notice right here where it says variables and it says num1, you notice there are quotation marks around that 5, which means that it's storing that 5 as a string because strings are identified by quotation marks. All right, and then I'm going to enter 3. And we have the same thing for 3. So we just confirm that the input function takes in everything as a string. So now let's look at how we can change that. Let's look at what we can use to change it from a string to a number. All right, so I've added two lines, line 4 and line 5, and that is type conversion. So really all type conversion is you type the data type you want to change it to. So I want to change these strings into integers. So I type int, and then I put the data inside parentheses, and then this will convert it, take this data, num1, and return the integer version of num1, and we will store num1, the integer version, inside the variable. All right, so a few things have happened. I've added two lines of code, line 4 and line 5, and we'll see what these are and what they do in a second. But essentially, they are type conversion. So this is how we use type conversion. So in type conversion, we wrap data that we want to convert. So in this case, num1 and num2. We wrap that in the parentheses, and then we put the data type that we want to change it to outside. So we've seen that num1 and num2, they're initially strings because we use the input function. So I want to change them to integers. So I type int in front of them, and I put them inside the parentheses. So what happens is that the type conversion function will change them to integers and then store that integer inside the variable, right? And if I wanted to change it to a float instead, I would simply type FOLAT, and that's it. And if I had to change it to a string, it would be str. If I had to change it to a bool, it would be bool, right? But we're changing them to integers, so we'll stick with that. All right, so we have our debugger open, so let's see how this works. All right, so it starts off asking me for the number for number 1. So I enter 5, and then I enter 3. So if you notice, after that variable, after the input function in line 1 and line 2, num1 and num2 are holding 5 and 3, but they still have quotation marks around them. So that means that they are still strings. So now we get to line 4, and line 4 is where the first type conversion happens. So let's see what happens when we run line 4. So after line 4, you notice num1 is no longer a string. Num1 is now an integer. And now we're at line 5, where we change num2. And after line 5, num2 is now an integer and no longer a string. So let's see what happens in line 7. We have 2 integers now, so the output should be an integer. And just like that, we have sum being 8. So type conversion allows us to work with strings, or any data type really, and change it to another data type.